Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. Joining me today as co-host is the lovely Sally Ann Burris. Always nice to have her here. Let me introduce our interviewee. Hopefully, you've all just seen his interview. I'd just like to hand over to a very warm welcome, James. Perhaps wonderful book, the writer of this wonderful book. You must go out and buy it after this. James, very warm welcome. Perhaps you'd like to say something of yourself and how you've come here.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me, and thanks for those that are there, and hopefully get some decent questions from you. Ask nothing's too difficult to answer, so ask away. Yeah, I wrote It Doesn't Happen to Men, which is my story of domestic abuse, and I was married for 20 years in the end, and it was okay at the start, but towards the end, the last sort of 10 years, things changed quite rapidly, which is all in the book. And the book really centers around how, the relationship developed, how we met. Then there's a centerpiece, which was a diary that I kept for a year. And that diary was the turning point. That's what woke me up as to what was happening. But then the third part of the book is the 4 years after the diary that took me to actually escape the actual marriage and get out there and actually be free again. So yeah, that's my story there. So that's my main thing. I'm an author. I'm a coach. I do talks on domestic violence, things like that. I support men particularly, but also women. They come to me through the website and that, and make contact, and I support them and in their situations, and advise wherever I can, and put them in touch with organisations where if they can need help. So.
Can I start with Sally? I'll start with a question from Steve Moxon, and he says, "Okay." He's basically saying, right, there's a ban on words longer than 9 letters. Okay, so he says, well, I shall have to turn your video off if you keep disobeying me there, Sally. So James, Steve says, do you think your former other half's partner violence was simply uninhibited expression or psychopathology? I think that's what he meant by the more than 9 words, more than 9 letters. He says, I ask this because it relates to theoretical debate.
I would have to know what that means in the first place. So if you have to put it in simple terms,
that's a very good point. Thank you for.
It's not. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a normal guy who is a survivor from this. Although I'm a trained coach, life coach, and I'm currently doing training for counselling to be a counsellor. So, but it's not. I've not studied a lot of psychology, couldn't really answer that one.
No, that's a very good point, James. So, Steve, if you could translate that into plain English, I look forward to...
And that's why you said 9 letters, yeah.
Yeah. So, Sally, do you want to carry on?
Well, indeed. He means a deficient emotional response. So when somebody...
I'll leave that. Should we come back to that? Let's come back to that.
I'll explain the background. Is that I believe that she had either narcissistic personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, and intertwined with that, she had OCD, which goes quite often hand in hand. Her mother seems that narcissistic, and quite often, an offspring can be narcissistic or borderline personality. That's where I believe it's come from, and so her empathy just wasn't there, and she would fake empathy, as in she knew she had to have it. She was very intelligent, and so would mask it. So it was a long while before you dug in below the surface before you recognized what she was truly like at times. And at times she could be very, very caring. But she would care on things that were important to her, that she sees important. So such as education. At this moment in time, my youngest is going through GCSEs, and there is nothing in her life apart from study. Did really well in the mock, so that proves that in some cases it works. But that's her way of caring, and that's her way of doing it. And if he was to not study when she'd scheduled time and given him work to do, that's when she would lose it. That's when she would probably do that. That still happens now.
Okay, so Steve Moxon has clarified that he meant mental illness. So I think you've just
yeah. So technically, yeah. That's.
I'd just like to pick up on the very interesting point you make about empathy, because I guess the standard belief among most people is that women are more empathetic than men. But I think there's another side to that coin, as there often is. And the other side of that coin is that women, because you talked about your ex faking empathy, which interested me, because I think plenty of women do that in order to manipulate. It's a favorite female tactic in my experience. But other people I've spoken to have said the same thing.
Yeah, and I'd say it's not. It's not a male. It's not purely a male-female thing. I think it's a personality type. I think it's a type of person who will try and manipulate, and you learn it as a young child. You learn to manipulate and do things, and depends on the environment you're brought up in, I believe. So, I mean,
do you find right? Because to me, there's a very strong gender divide in the use of empathy or the pretense of empathy. Okay, Sally, any thoughts on that?
I mean, it is a sickness, and it's normally, there's a trauma impact, whatever that trauma is. It's normal to come from a trauma impact, and it can happen very, very young. And there's no gender requirement in there. It can happen to men and to women. And you're right, lots of people will learn very quickly how to manipulate. They'll know the emotional value. They'll know what they need to think. It is likely, for example, that your ex-partner's viewpoint on education was that her children would need to succeed because she would need them to, for her, not for them, but she would need them to. I mean, this is an example of. So the reflection of anybody around you when you're in a narcissistical relationship or a partnership is that it's all about them. So if the children fail, it's all about them. If the children succeed, it's all about them. They don't understand anybody else's perspective in this. And the social graces are there, so they know what empathy looks like or how they're expected to behave. But again, there is no gender. I've met some extremely narcissistical men, as I have extremely narcissistical women. You know, there is no gender.
Okay, all right. So, Sally, do you want to go to the question stream and start with Sean?
Lovely. So Sean says, James, your story was harrowing at times. I caught myself thanking my lucky stars I never married. YouTube is full of people counselling young men never to risk it. What do you feel about that?
Well, I would have probably, you know, in the time, well, whilst I was in the marriage and the short time afterwards, I would probably have thought, no, I'm not going to go there again. Marriage isn't good. But that's because I'd been in a bad marriage and one that didn't work. And it's to say that it never worked. You know, it was okay at certain points, and it was not the marriage that was the issue. It was the personality of the person. So I don't think it's marriage. I'm very pro marriage. I think it's the person. It's marrying the right person. And quite times we are pushed into getting married, you know, for the wrong reasons, or because you know, it could be family, could be religious, could be just the fact that you feel it's the right thing to do, or you feel pressured. I mean, I remember it all kind of happened. You know, we met, we were going out. Next thing we were engaged. Next thing we were married. Then it was, you know, it just kind of all followed and just seemed like the next thing. But what I will say is that I came out that marriage, and then I met someone not long after I managed to get out who probably help save me. If I hadn't had that relationship and the strength of that person, I probably would have gone back at some point in time, because it happened several times. I wasn't really strong on my own. I'd been put down for so long. And that second marriage is now 5 years old, over 5 years old. And it's the most amazing marriage ever. We don't argue, we don't fight, we support one another. So I've seen both sides. I've seen the wrong marriage and I've seen the right marriage with the right person. So I'd say find the right person to marry. Don't just marry because you want to marry. So
a couple of points in the chat stream. Sean G says, empathetic is the wrong word for selective compassion, which I think is rather interesting. Steve Moxon, borderline personality disorder is very much a female typical condition. I believe that to be true.
Yeah, that's borderline. Yeah.
Dean Hedges says, I've been told. Sorry, when I sought assistance, I was told domestic abuse only gets worse. James, have you found this to be so, or do some abusers go into remission?
it depends on what you do. It depends on the person, but in a lot of cases, when you try to, so when I understood what was going on and I started recognizing the behavior and not reacting to it, things stepped up a gear because I wasn't reacting. Then she would step up a gear. Then I would say violence happened a lot more than just the verbal and abusive, and then the insults became more and more personal as well. So I think when you change your tactic or you understand what's going on, when interestingly I did, we talked about this briefly, but I did try to go to court, and I was advised. I went to court and I got help from it. It was a solicitors that primarily dealt with women in the situation. They were passed on by a local women's help centre who welcomed me. They were fine, and they advised me, and I think they advised me the same kind of way they advised a woman. And we went for all the different court orders, and I just didn't get it. But I had to go back to the house at that point in time. And for a short period of time, she did kind of realize and step back and behave herself, but it really didn't last. And then, but the whole thing about that was I had done that to her. What she saw is that I had taken her to court. I had gone and made these allegations about her, which obviously weren't true, and I had done all these things. So therefore, I was the one that had to make up for it, and I had to suffer. So in that case, it did step up. It's the same when I had an affair and we tried to go to Relate for counselling. Her idea was that the Relate, the counsellor, the lady would be telling me what I've done wrong and what I needed to do to fix the marriage. Where actually she was very balanced to understand the reasons why he had an affair. All right, you didn't have sex with him for 3 years, or you did this, or you don't support him in this way. Address those issues. No, she didn't want to do that because it was my fault, not hers.
Sally?
Yeah. So we've got another one from Landray. I hope I pronounced that correctly. James, I thought I heard in your interview that you have moved on and now in a good relationship with a woman. Can you tell us something about your experience learning to trust again, being vulnerable, and taking the risks necessary to engage in an intimate relationship again? What an amazing question.
Yeah, that is really good because well, my first thing is I had a lot of time in that abusive marriage, being told how I was rubbish and I was useless and that I was ugly and I was this and I was that, and that no one would be interested in me, and I'd live all alone in a dingy flat with no money and nothing. And those are kind of threats that stop you from breaking free as well, because when they come and again, you begin to kind of believe them, at least to an element. But my idea was that basically, if you fall off the horse, get straight back on the horse. And that's not calling a woman a horse, but that analogy is that I just wanted to get back out in the game there. And so I went on some dating sites and I dated, and I had a few dates, and it was interesting, but I was quite careful, and there was a few people I met, and I was kind of like, no, that's not right. There's nothing right here. And then when I met my current wife, things just clicked immediately, and it always has done. So from that perspective, we were very open and honest about where we'd both come from. She'd had an abusive relationship, but not to the extent of mine. It was much short-lived, and there was no physical involved. But she'd escaped one and kind of understood, and she's quite empathetic, and it worked quite well. But the trust thing took time. I'd say it really did take time, and repairing, my own self-esteem. She was quite good in that. She's obviously she was younger than me. She was very good looking, and that really helped boost my own confidence and understanding that there is something good about me. But what I had to learn is I had to learn to love myself. I had to learn to understand that what happened wasn't my fault, and actually writing the book was probably a big step in that. Actually writing it all down and kind of pouring it out there. So forgiving my ex was another big turning point in it as well. Also, my new wife is a Christian, so I became a Christian. I was a Christian beforehand, but I wasn't really practicing, and I didn't get it. I didn't have the experience, but I actually came to Christ, and that changed my life. And so that also was another support structure that I had that helped me learn more and discover about who I was. And I also went through a number of heart attacks. In 2018, I survived 6 heart attacks and a triple bypass, and that whole experience. I mean, that's probably another book I need to write on that experience. But that whole experience, strengthened me and really reset. I spent a lot of time thinking, whilst convalescent. I wrote the book at that time, and I just had to really start again. But the key was to learn that I was valuable and that I had something to offer, and there were people around me. And I think the other thing, if I'd not had the support structure of my new family, my new wife around me when I had my heart attacks, if I'd have been in an old marriage, I don't think I'd be here today. There was times in there where I might, I felt suicidal. I didn't act on it because of the kids, because that wasn't me.
Mhm.
But I think health-wise, my health really deteriorated, and it came out of the blue. So yeah, there was a lot of things all mixed in afterwards that came out that had I stayed, I reckon I'd definitely not be here.
Okay. Landray, whose question that was, James, has a few more comments in the chat stream.
Yeah.
Selective compassion is a more specific description of an archetypal female characteristic, often mistaken for empathy. Empathy, purely defined, is more characteristic of male behavior. It is also demonstrably the result of masculine parental involvement. So fascinating comments there, I think. I'd just like to pick up something in that I recall from the book, James, and forgive me, I can't remember if we covered this in the interview. So if we did, maybe we can move on. But it was the occasion where your wife invited you to hit her.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could. That's very interesting to me. I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, I think we did touch on it, but it's a common thing that happens. One of the things I've been invited to do through contacts, I'm going to speak at a men's prison as well, because there's the reason being is they said there's quite a few guys in there who are in for domestic violence against women, but the pastor that's bringing me in had spoken to them, and some of them said that they suffered for years before they broke.
Right.
And this provocation, and this is someone in your face,
Yes.
right close to you, you can smell their breath, they're spitting in your face as they diatribe of abuse, and pointing at you, poking, expecting you. And I kind of, if you do that and it's kind of like, come on, then you go and do it. And this was before I knew what was going on. I didn't know that she had all these tactics. She was trying to goad me and bait me. But I was just enough to hang back and not do it. But at that point, she was saying, go on, you do it. You will lose everything. And that is a big thing, is that when a woman goes and cries for help about domestic abuse, they're automatically believed, they're automatically supported, they're automatically get the law, the police, people are generally on their side no matter what, and they have that. But I've seen it firsthand. I'm supporting a gentleman at the moment whose wife has cried, his ex-wife, or the split up, has cried wolf because he was being abused by her, but she's now saying it was him. He's abused her, and she has no evidence and no proof, but still he's going through the court process. Now, funny enough, the 2 children that they had together are with him, and they're still with him, and he's got that, even though there's still custody going on. So things are maybe changing a bit, but especially this is 10 years ago that this happened to me. It was really difficult, really biased against men, and she was right.
It's no better now, trust me.
No.
But I was interested. One of the angles of that story that interested me was that she was actually explicit about what would happen if you went through with it.
Yeah.
How many women? I would think for every woman like that, there must be 100 who won't say what the consequences will be, that they'll lose the house, they'll never see the kids again, and so on. But Bill Burr, there's a famous bit of there's a wonderful American stand-up comedian called Bill Burr, one of my comedy heroes, and he says, look, if I met up with some friends in a bar or socially somewhere for a coffee, and my arm was in a sling, and they said, "Hey, Bill, what's happened?" He said, "Oh, I got bitten by a rattlesnake." They would all say in unison, "How the hell did you get bitten by a rattlesnake? What's the backstory?" And he says, "Why can't we do that when a man hits a woman?" And he said, "It's gone really quiet in here, hasn't it?" And then people laughed, And he's quite right. It's like men are so disinclined. The overwhelming majority of men are so disinclined to hit women. They are socially conditioned mainly by women from their earliest days to not hit girls, not hit women.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been struck by a couple of female partners. Wouldn't dream. I mean, in both cases, alcohol fueled. It would not have occurred to me in a month of Sundays to have hit them back.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, women know what their power is. I mean, there's no question about it. The idea that there's never a good reason to hit a woman. Well, I mean, perhaps we should say, look, whether you're a man or woman, if you hit a man or a woman, expect to be hit back. But
Yeah.
men won't do it.
That's
men won't do
equality.
it.
That's proper equality for you, isn't it?
Well,
parity.
Yes. Well, indeed. So, Sally, do you want to move on to the next question?
Yeah. So this question's from Steve, and it says, well, don't you think that PV is the unwarranted mode of expression? Research shows women chose violence as their preferred mode of aggression in a couple context. So what might prompt it? Maybe the relationship dynamics or even the other partner? ?
I don't.
Yeah. So I think it's that partner violence is the unwarranted mode of expression.
Yeah.
So yeah. So research shows that women chose violence as their preferred mode of aggression in a couple context.
Yeah.
What might prompt it to be the relationship dynamics? So what might motivate it?
Yeah, I mean, I would, from my experience, people would have looked at me and said, she wears the trousers, or he's under the thumb. So there was a definite relationship dynamic there that she was the one that ruled the roost, and you see that quite often. So there was a definite dynamic in the first instance. So she felt the one that was in power, and she felt she had power over me. But the violence would come because of it's all linked to her OCD and the breaking of any of her rules, or that her understanding that you didn't follow her rules generally. It wasn't normal. It wasn't about who left the door open or that, unless it was about stepping on the wrong thing with these shoes, or not getting changed, or not having a shower, or not cleaning something properly. Those things would trigger her emotions, and she would burst off, and it was all linked together. It wasn't so there was something within the relationship that she was kind of the dominant one potentially, and there, even though I'm quite an alpha male myself, she was kind of dominant and had control. I would, if I wanted to do something, I would go and ask permission, but that was a situation that she created over time, because if I decided to think, if I would decide to go for a pint after work with some guys from work and didn't get permission, oh, hell would break loose when I get home. I'd get a tirade. So I would be, oh, the guys want to go for a pint. Can I go? And then people would know that I would have to ask permission for these things. So there was a definite situation created. But the actual violence and the tip of that was I have to say, was more related to her mental illness and her OCD and her lack of control over that.
I asked somebody who obviously shan't name, a man, if he could co-host one of these days with me, and he said, "Oh, well, I'll have to clear it with my girlfriend." I thought, this is a men's issues conference. I mean, you couldn't make up that answer, could you?
No.
So, and I guess the girlfriend said no. So
he's not.
Yeah.
Whereas in the relationship I have now, and it took a long while to get to that point. I know I don't have to ask her if I want to do something. I could say, "Oh, I'm going to do this," but even then I'll say, "Are you okay with that?" And part of that is courtesy. So, it starts off as a courtesy, but when it became a prerequisite to doing anything, and most of the answers were no, you can't, then you're in a real sticky situation.
Well, Paul Elam, who's a great MRA, often says that one of the mark of a man's character is his ability to say no to women. And he talks about, you'll have to cover your ears for this, Sally, because I know you'll be terribly shocked. He talks about the need to put new female partners through a shit test or shit tests.
Yeah.
And one of them is quite early on in the relationship, so that you don't waste time with the wrong woman. If she wants something and you simply say no, how does she respond? And if she says things like, fine, no problem, with that certain tone in her voice, and you're going to get crap for it.
Yeah.
He says, don't waste any more time, because a spouse who cannot take no for an answer, and he says it's not something huge, but if she asks, can they go to a restaurant one night, and you say no, I'm too tired or something, and she keeps persisting. If she can't take no, she is not going to be a good partner. It's really quite as simple as that.
But the thing is that when you're in the situation and you're dating, and maybe the person's really attractive, or there's something about them you really like, you overlook those kind of things. You just think, oh, that's fine, and those red flags are waving you in your face,
Right.
and you just don't see them. And then hindsight is the greatest thing. There's a saying that I saw in Germany. This was our last family holiday. It was written on the wall of this hotel, and it said basically, you can understand your life by looking backwards, but you can only live it by looking forwards. And that was also the point where I decided I was leaving. So it was quite a fundamental, and I maintain that you can look back and say, oh, I recognize that, which helps you learn going forwards, but it doesn't help you at the time. And you still, a lot of people don't even do that, and they make the same mistakes again and again. It's quite often guys like me will go from one relationship to another with a similar type person, because that's maybe what you're attracted to or you feel drawn towards, and that person is the wrong type for you, and it doesn't work, and you end up in the same situation.
Indeed,
So,
indeed. Yeah. No, Sean G says, I can see this happening. He says no, she appears to accept it, but she files it away as a grievance for later retribution.
Oh yes.
So your enjoyment of the present permission is clouded by fearing what's coming. Very good point, yes. Sean. I'd like to come
spot on.
I'd like to come to got some really interesting questions here. Thank you all for them. Tom Chadwick, thank you for sharing your story, James. It sounds like a horrible experience you've been through. Question: what was your view? What were your views on men's rights before your first marriage, and how have your views on men's rights changed as a result of your experience?
I probably didn't give it a second thought. I don't think men's rights were on my agenda at all. I was a man, and I just didn't think it was a problem, because I didn't encounter it, and I hadn't seen it anywhere at all within in my context. And it wasn't out there, there wasn't really out there. Afterwards, obviously, I've seen how I've been treated. I've seen how there was the inequality on certain issues, and that's not to say that what's in place for women, let's say, and if we take the domestic violence situation, isn't needed and isn't right. What I'm saying is that having all the support and the funding given to Women's Aid and organizations like that, having the helplines is great, but why isn't there the same for men? That's my question, and that's what I see as the issue, is that whether you're a man or a woman, and if you're in need, you need help there. I don't see cancer treatment being gender biased at all. If you've got cancer, you go and you get, if you have a heart attack, actually they're very well set up for men, because more men have it. So the lack of that is definitely more visible now that I've been in there.
Yeah, just want to pick you up on a couple of things there. Why is there no money for men? Because feminists in the 50-plus-year-old domestic violence industry make sure there's no money for men. Anything that becomes available is hoovered up by men. They've utterly corrupted government departments. They've corrupted everything. And as for cancers, on the contrary, the number one killer of the number one cancer killing men today is prostate cancer. More men die from prostate cancer than women die of breast cancer, and yet there's a screening program for breast cancer. There's a screening program for cervical cancer. There are no male specific. I mean, the healthcare differentials are absolutely shocking in that. But that's another issue altogether. Sorry, Sally, I can't remember. Is it your turn? I think it's your turn, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Go on.
So I think there's the first one is already been read, isn't it? It hasn't just been Sean again.
I don't think so, Sally. Sorry, let me just have a quick look at it. I don't think so. Or
yeah, it is.
Okay, I had a senior moment then in that case.
Yeah, we have.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'll move that.
No,
okay.
It's confused me a few times. It's okay. So this is again from Sean. He said, "Did you get any informal support in the bad times? Were friends and family ready to rally around and stick up for you?
Well, yes and no, as in obviously I didn't know what was going on, but I had some people at work that I could confide in and talk about. So I had some people I worked with that I felt close enough and open enough, and they were distant enough to be able to talk to and ask for advice. And the two main people there were actually other women as well, who I got on really well with. So I kind of realized, I knew that it wasn't women that were the issue. It was this particular one as well. And they would help, they would listen, they'd go for some advice and stuff like that as well, which is good. Family wise, I never particularly talked to my parents about it. They knew kind of what was going on. I didn't know how much they could see until afterwards. But in the book, towards the end, my mother died, towards the end of the book. And that was a big turning point for me, because I actually, on her deathbed, actually told her what was going on and told her I planned to leave. And instead of my mum being a strong Catholic woman who, had been married to one man all her life, who, believed in that, she was like, oh, thank God for that. She was like, I wish you'd have left her years ago. I wished, I'd have felt, because I think at one point they tried to talk to me and interfere. And I just said, butt out, keep out. This is my marriage. Don't get into it. And so they just took that and didn't. And it's unfortunate that that was the case, because I could have done with more support. But they were always supportive. If I knew if I'd have gone to them, but we just didn't talk that way. But towards it, after I'd left, my mum had already died by then. But my relationship with my dad, and he read the book, and he read the original, which before and before there was anything kind of changed in it, and he was absolutely shocked because of some of the things that were in there were said about him and my mother and stuff. Yeah, he just had no time, obviously no time for her, but and it made total sense to him once he read the book. So
we campaigned outside I mean, for a few years now, our main campaign has been around domestic violence, and we campaigned outside the Conservative Party conference maybe 6 or 7 weeks ago. And I had a placard, you might remember this, Sally, of a battered man, a battered young man. And virtually, and we handed out, I think, best part of 2,000 leaflets about the truth about domestic violence. So it was a useful exercise. Just about all the people who came up to me to thank me for campaigning were women. And they said, you're quite right. We know plenty of violent women. Thank you for speaking the truth. And very few. There were one or two young feminist women who just simply wouldn't accept what's been known for 30, 40, 50 years about domestic violence. But the men were just kind of embarrassed in the main, I think. And it was the same on abortion, actually. When I was carrying a pro-abortion, I'm sorry, a pro-life placard, it was the women that came up and said thank you. It wasn't the men. They were embarrassed.
I mean, when it comes to men's issues like domestic violence, I mean, the reason why the stats show that more women are victims or have been subjected to it is because men don't come forward. Men hide it. And I've actually done some talks overseas in a couple of different countries, and culture plays a big part. And we're moving forward, but some cultures, they just definitely would not say anything because they would get laughed at or chucked out by the police. Here we don't perhaps get laughed at, but you still don't get the support. So men, there's still a taboo. We're still told men still have to, chin up, man up, don't cry. Those kind of things don't help. And so a man talking about this, lots and lots don't. And that was the whole purpose of me writing and telling my story. Apart from the fact I felt it had to get out there because I couldn't see another book like this that a man had written. So, but I know, and some of the forums I'd been in, so go into some of these forums where the men do talk about it, where they can be open, and most of them were saying that they wouldn't go and say out in public that they'd been through this or they were going through it. But in the locked forum, and the one that was Shrink for Men is a really good one that I got involved in.
Dr. Tara Palmatia,
and I've connected. I've got some real offline after that, made some real good friends, in different parts of the world and supported them. And I think that showed that it is there, but men don't talk about it. So I thought if I write the book, put it out there, maybe some men do. And I do work on this. That's part of my coaching, part of my work with men is to try and get men to talk about stuff as well.
I see Steve is posting some comments on the stats here. Well, Steve Moxon and I should say Steve Moxon, the author of the brilliant book The Woman Racket, 2008. He really owes me a beer or two after this conference, I think, because I've plugged his book 20 times, I think. But he's as frustrated as I am when men's domestic violence organizations and charities come out with things like a third of domestic violence victims are men. It's nonsense, and it's known to be nonsense for I think there's even an Australian charity called 1 in 3. The bottom line on this, and you and I discussed this, but in case anybody here is not aware of it, the most extensive survey ever of the domestic violence literature was reported by the Partner Abuse State of Knowledge Project in 2013, or PASC 13, as I'm calling it. And one of the findings, one of the most jaw-dropping findings, was that in heterosexual couples, because lesbian couples are unusually violent, but in heterosexual couples, about 60% of the violence is bidirectional. So sometimes the woman will start the physical violence and sometimes the man. But in the 40% where it's always one way, the perpetrator is twice as likely to be the woman as the man. It's but I pointed Anne Widdecombe to that. You might find that an interesting interview, James. She wouldn't accept that, and she kept on coming out with, well, in most marriages the man is bigger than the woman, so I don't know why men don't, and we were just going around in circles, or I was going around in circles. So she just believed all these feminist myths. It was very frustrating. And just finally, I don't know if no reason you should be aware, but Sally and I interviewed an American MRA this morning, Anil Kumar, and he spoke about how in India it is not possible for a man to have a woman charged with domestic violence. There is no law under which that can happen. Isn't that quite extraordinary? It's I mean in this country it's unusual or rare, but there it's not even possible. It's incredible.
No, it's incredible.
I don't know whether you know this, but potentially in the UK a woman can become 7 counts in domestic abuse once it's reported, whereas a man generally is only 2, and that's only if he gets the victim support call back. That the ONS stats, to submit to the ONS, you don't have to be accredited, and they don't audit their stats. This is something why it's on the 13 areas that we've got on our focus areas, because the ONS doesn't. I ran 3 times and spoke to top managers to say, because I'm used to delivering procured services, to say that I thought I was speaking to staff who didn't know what they were doing or were new or something like that, to be told 3 times that you don't have to be accredited to gather the stats, so there's no training or awareness that you need to be aware of, and that they weren't audited. But if you wanted to access the stats, because they've got a massive library, the ONS, and if you want to access all of their background stats and evidence, you have to be accredited to be able to access those stats. So when you talk about, there are stats coming out now that says that in the UK, domestic abuse is actually 50-50 in terms of men and women. So I think this is information a lot of people don't realise, they don't realise how it's correlated and how it's handed over to the ONS in the UK. And it's mirrored in a few different other countries.
Steve Moxon adds, even the ONS concedes men are 3 times less likely to report partner violence than do women. A more realistic estimate is 10 times, and the reality may be 20 times or more. And he says, yes, I owe you at least 3 pints. Thank you, Mike. And he makes an interesting point, which I think we missed earlier, that bidirectional partner violence is almost is mostly female initiated.
It is, yeah.
So I was talking about earlier, the provocation. They know how to pull.
Men do not just have a bad day at work and hit their wives. It doesn't happen, or it's so vanishingly rare. Anyway, okay, I think, is it my question next?
It's your turn.
Okay. Dean Hedges says couples therapy is an option, but my little experience of this only demonstrated that feminist misandry has leaked into the field. I suspect it's been there for probably 50 years, to be frank.
Yeah.
Have you found this to be so, James? He asks.
So I touched on it earlier, but I didn't find that to be in my one case that we were there, but because and it didn't work purely because of the personality disorder, that was there. That this is someone who sees them as superior to anyone because she was a professional and chose that career. So when she looked at choosing what career she was going to do, she did the research to see which ones earned the most money. And picked one of those, and that's kind of the character. But yes, she believed, and that's why she hasn't got help for the OCD even to this day, because she believes that if she wants to help herself, she can do it better than anyone else. She just doesn't want to deal with it. So I didn't have that experience, but I can understand why that might be the case for many.
Yeah, Steve Moxon, some very interesting comments. The upshot is that partner violence is not non-gendered. It's the inverse of the feminist model. Deborah Powney is wrong. Deborah Powney is wrong. I never thought I'd see those words in that sequence. Sally, I think you're the next question.
Okay, so this is from an anonymous attendee, and they say, I never hear men talking about fear of violence. Most men I know have been assaulted on the street, but never talk about it. After being attacked twice as a teenager, I was scared to go out at night, but I never spoke about it. What do you think would happen if men started talking openly and honestly about the violence that they have experienced and they fear? Should men be more open about their experiences?
Well, I think it's 100% needed. That's where we need to go. Men need to open up and talk more about these, and they need to, not only that, they need to be listened to by the media, by people in there that actually listen to it, because all we've got is it's all gender-based violence. It's all about women and girls, and I totally agree. We need to protect our women and girls. They need protected from will but we all need protecting from it. And I think that what you'd see is a fundamental shift in understanding and attitude. But that will take a long time to change the current situation. But it will only happen if guys speak up and speak forward, because I think walking down the street in London in certain parts and certain states and certain big cities, it could be Glasgow, could be anywhere. It doesn't have to be just London, but you walk down the street there at night, guys are going to be as scared as women at times, especially walking past a group of men, because they'll get targeted just as much. So, but they wouldn't talk about it. They just don't talk about it. They don't say about it. And I think there's just there's a stigma against talking about your situation as a man, whether that be any kind of violence, or whether it be domestic abuse, whether it be your health. It's the kill. Yeah, I'm all right. And the whole ask twice question, this is why, because men don't talk about stuff, the male suicide rate is so high, and that 70% of suicides are 75% are male, and it's the biggest killer of men under 50. That's why it happens, and that would be the result of men talking about it, as we'd probably see less men's suicide, less men's death.
James, I think there is something in that, but I've got to say, I've studied suicide a huge amount, and a lot of the reasons that men commit suicide are things that, for most men at least, talking about it wouldn't help. And the most obvious one is denial of access to children, and it's something that organizations like Families Need Fathers see all the time. If the reality is that for whatever reason you are never going to see your children again, why would you go somewhere every week? And it's like so men deal with it by drawing a line under it, gritting their teeth, stoically, and moving on, because the reality is, it's the reason that the male suicide rate triples after exposure to the family courts. And it'd be far worse if men weren't stoic. We have an interesting point. So what I was trying to say in a roundabout way is that saying that men commit suicide because they can't talk about it is very much saying that men need to be more like women, which is what actually some MPs in Parliament have said in various debates. Sean G says, in his 1990 book Male Rape, Richie McMullen lists 5 reasons men don't report being raped: shock, embarrassment, fear, stigma, and self-blame. Interesting.
Can I just add something to that, to the anonymous question? One of the things in the research that hit me quite quickly was that when you don't talk about these things, there's another side of that. There's somebody, it's not that you need to be responsible for somebody else's pain, but by not saying, every meeting I went in, statutory meeting, police, all of that, what I get from them constantly is, oh yes, Sally, we know men have needs and they need help, but they don't tell us, do they? And there's a dismissive tone in that, where if they don't tell us, we can't do anything about it. But the other side of that, I've had women who have absolutely come to me sobbing because they batter their husbands. They know what they're doing. They've gone and looked for help and they've not been able to source it. And I think that sometimes, I know it's hard to go and tell somebody, but unless you do, it will never change. It just won't. And you have a right to feel safe. We know that there's more men murdered, generally more homicides than women.
But that pre-assumes, Sally, that going to talk to someone who's going to do anything about it. Who is a father denied access to his children going to go to actually change the reality of being able to see his children? There is nobody. Steve Moxon says men don't talk about anything where they are a victim, as it lowers status, making suicide still more likely. Very interesting point.
Yeah, so for me, it wasn't the man talking about his situation that helps. It's the fact that the more we talk about it, the more the situation gets discussed and is out there and gets dealt with at the source.
Yeah.
So if you're talking about a man who's not going to see his children, and parental alienation and various other things that are the cause of these situations, then from that point, by raising the awareness, by getting people talking about it and understanding that it does happen, it's there, the chances are you might be able to reduce the element of it happening. So yeah, on an individual basis, some of them might not help the suicide, but if we were over time to stop the situations happening that cause the suicide, then that's how we would reduce the suicide. So it's more getting to the source of it. And I think
but it flies. Yes, it's a very interesting point, that James. But it's to me, it comes back to the thing about stoicism again. It's one of the finest male qualities, I think. But what is absolutely valuable and very often life-saving for men as individuals is utterly disastrous for men as a class, because it means that the state can get away with providing no support for male victims, and all this list to the side of me. How does the state get away with this crap? It gets away with it because men collectively will not fight for their rights. Simple as that.
Well, I mean, to be honest with you, we need voices. There's only one way this will change, and that's with voices.
I think what we need, Sally, is for people to listen. It's not that men don't. Yeah. It's not that men don't. Men have been talking about these problems since forever. The reality is that nobody's listening. Nobody. Let's say politicians, most certainly, are not listening.
Well, my answer to this, when this is given to me, my answer always is to this: then you're not asking in the right way. Because if you ask in the right way, because men communicate differently. In my experience of working with men, they communicate differently. So I say to them, you have to shift your policy in the way you have those conversations to include men. So that's my part. But men do need to have an authentic voice, because any procurement, any management of any fiscal spending for services, frontline services, there's a consultation process, and without that voice, they will naturally assume there is no need.
Sally, I have to say, I mean, perhaps we should have a discussion outside of this, but my experience of campaigning for 9 years is that you can present facts until you're blue in the face, and as I've done in a number of areas, but at the end of the day, it's not how you say. I mean, I'm fairly controversial, I suppose, and I'm fairly blunt. But there are people who are far more diplomatic than me. Let's say in the area of domestic violence, people like Mark Brooks, I'm sorry, of the Mankind Initiative, who I know you talk very highly of, James. I mean, a far more emollient, pleasant person than I am. That's for sure. And yet I don't think he'd claim to have changed anything substantive. And he must have had a million conversations with politicians and agencies. It's not how we say it, Sally. I can assure you, every way of saying has been tried. It's just not listened to. And in the case of domestic violence, it's because it's a feminist industry. It's a billion, it's a huge feminist industry. And I do not believe that the way that men present to politicians has got anything to do with the fact that the politicians are not doing things.
I understand, I hear you, I genuinely do. But when they're talking about changing services and fiscal spending and things like that, like I've worked with guys who have come to me, they've been attacked, whatever, and I say to them, please consider disclosing. Then they'll come back to me 3 weeks later and say, I didn't follow through, or I did ring them, but I didn't go down the station. Then it happens again, and I say, please go and report it. And then they come back to me 3 weeks later and they say to me, I've left there, that's great. So she won't let me see the children. And I say to them gently, I say, that's why I tell you to report it. Because the stats, the evidence, when you look at governance, they justify it by saying there's only a third. Whereas, we did some research with talking to frontline police officers instead of believing the stats, and said to them, how do you calculate your stats? How many people do you think are the victims? They told me 50-50. But I don't know whether you know this, when the police turn up to a property from a report from a neighbour or somebody else, even if there is no contentious attitude from anybody in that house and they can't prove anything, when they leave, they have to choose one of those people. And because of the psychology behind what's in the media, they invariably will choose the man as the perpetrator without no evidence, without nothing. They have to choose one person. So
I agree, Sally. But in a sense, the stats literally don't matter, and the reason it doesn't matter whether men are a third, a half, 2/3, 90% of victims, because at the end of the day, there's the eternal problem, which is the empathy gap. And we wouldn't say, feminists will often say, well, they have to keep this myth up that men are a minority of victims to hoover up all the money. Nobody would say, well, black women or black people are a minority, black women are a minority of women's violence, so we're not going to care about them.
I guess
it doesn't work with race. It doesn't work with race. So it begs the question, why does it work with gender?
No action is no return. That's it. Unless there is action that is countable action, there will never be any return. You are right.
We have 1 minute left, Sally.
Okay, sorry.
Do you have a very quick question? Do you have a question which James can?
I was just going to say, I did go to the police and I gave them a record. And the reason I went to the police is that I was advised to, because if they turn up to the house when she's called them, like she threatened to do, after hitting me, then they would come and arrest me and believe her. But if they knew the backstory, if they'd known that, then I had a chance, and that's why I did it. And they were actually very receptive and very, very supportive. Actually, they're probably the best of the organisations I did speak to.
That's really, really good.
Can I just end with a very quick personal anecdote? It's to do with probably the best friend I've ever had in my life, a Welsh woman, who I simply adored. It was never more than a platonic relationship, but I just love that woman. And she had a drink problem and eventually died as a result of it. But she had when she was maybe in her 40s, she had a boyfriend. He was a giant of a man, 6'4", built like a brick outhouse, and he awoke one night to. She could get violent when after drinking, and he awoke suddenly around midnight to find her leaning over him, about to plunge a carving knife into his chest. So he pushed her off, and still very drunk, she went into the garden, got a half brick and smashed it into the side of her face. And this is not his account, this is her account to me. And the police treated him so viciously that he came close to committing suicide 2 or 3 days later. So anyway, I'm not saying that's representative of anything, but this stuff happened. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much, James, for your excellent.
You're welcome. Thanks everyone for the questions. Yeah,
everyone buy this book. Thank you very much, Sally.
Yeah, put it out on Twitter for you.
Thank you to the attendees. Thanks for your level of engagement. Thanks for the great questions, and hopefully you'll join us in an hour's time for a Q&A with the wonderful people at Gender Parity UK, including Sally,
who I know.
Who
That's how I know Sally.
Yeah. So see you all in an hour, I hope.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.